I'm delighted to be here today. I'm with Electric Power Research Institute. Phil gave me a promotion. I'm not the director of our climate program. That would be a fellow named Richard Richels, who's a lead author at the IPCC and has been for many, many years. But I'm one of the senior program people in the program. My particular expertise is offsets. And I'm really delighted to be here because we're actually funders of the nitrous oxide work that you saw presented by several of the previous speakers. I found Phil in Baltimore about 4 or 5 years ago, and we hatched this idea of looking at nitrous oxide emission reductions in agricultural production through the reduction of fertilizer use as a potentially very cost-effective and large-scale option, and I'm really excited that that work has proven out scientifically. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. I'm not going to talk so much about the corporate market for carbon credits. What I am going to talk about is the key role of greenhouse gas emission offsets in evolving U.S. climate policy. And that will definitely touch on the evolving market of carbon for the corporate sector. Just so you know who EPRI is, there's a lot of confusion about us. We're a nonprofit 501c3 research and technology organization, offices in Palo Alto, California, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Knoxville, Tennessee, and a number of satellites around the country. Our work's really in 5 areas: generation of electric power, including renewables; environment, all environment issues associated with electric power generation, dispatch, transmission, distribution, etc. Power delivery, market design, energy efficiency, nuclear power, and a whole program on innovation that's actually broader than just in the electric sector. Basically, every power company in the country is a member of some program at EPRI. And that's just not the investor-owned utilities, that's municipal utilities, public power, the federal power marketing agencies, merchant power generators, pretty much everybody in the power business is a member of some of our programs. Not all of them are members of the climate program, for sure. And then internationally, we have members in many, many countries abroad. So what I'd like to talk about today is really the challenge of greenhouse gas emission reductions overall, nationally, benefits and risks of greenhouse gas offsets in particular, and offsets as they're thought about in the current legislation that's passed the House, the so-called Waxman-Markey bill. Now, let's be clear. So this is business as usual emissions according to the United States Energy Information Agency going forward. And these 2 lines here, the green and the red, are the capped emissions under the Waxman-Markey bill or the Kerry-Boxer bill in the Senate. Okay? The key thing I want you to take away from this is to get to here is a very rapid and dramatic change in business as usual trajectory for greenhouse gas emissions. That's the key takeaway here. And the other key takeaway is all of these bills down here, and even this bill to a lesser extent, involve a cap and trade market. Nobody's talking seriously in Congress, at least nobody's put forward serious legislation calling for a carbon tax. So all the various legislative proposals that have legs are about cap and trade, or in the case of the Cantwell-Collins bill, what they'll call cap and dividend. Now, in the near term, let's be very clear. There is no large-scale, cost-effective technology that can reduce emissions at scale. Okay, there's no thing you can bolt on a power plant. There's nothing you can do in the economy that's a simple piece of technology, like a scrubber for SO2, like SCR for NOx control. There's just no technology out there. Now, EPRI's been working on a variety of technologies that Skiles talked about inside in the last session, things like advanced coal generation, things like carbon capture and storage, 3rd-generation nuclear plants, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. These are all incredible technologies that do have the potential to dramatically reduce emissions, but say post-2018. Okay, the narrow time frame is the time frame that's really, really hard, the near term. Okay, now in our view at EPRI, we've done modeling looking at how could you reduce emissions in the U.S. economy. Well, it turns out the electric sector is a very, very large component of emissions in the U.S. economy. About 33% of emissions U.S. come from the electric sector. And the electric sector really is the lowest hanging fruit to reduce emissions. Doesn't mean it's cheap. It just means it's cheaper than the other sectors. Cheaper than transportation, cheaper than other industrial processes, but definitely not cheap. And when we try to model this and we ask the question, how could you achieve the similar emission reductions trajectory as required in the Waxman-Markey bill or similar legislation, what we come up with is the near-term answer is fuel switching, real time. That is the real-time dispatch of natural gas plants instead of coal plants. And that only happens in the economy if carbon prices roughly are above $30 a ton CO2. And in many parts of the country, in this region in particular, that number is more like $50 a ton CO2. These are very, very high numbers. Politically in the US, anything north of 20 is pretty much considered not possible. Now, I'm not making a normative judgment myself. I'm just saying the way things have been stacking up in Washington, people talk about low as 10 to 20. North of 20 makes politicians very, very nervous in Washington. Okay, and there's only really three ways you're going to reduce this. One is you're going to have some kind of safety valve or price collar on the price of carbon. You're going to buy government fiat, say if carbon goes above 30, we're going to flood the market with credits, or we're going to allow companies to basically pay a fee, a tax, instead of having an allowance. An alternative would be somehow massive greenhouse gas emission reductions in other sectors of the economy. If you really believe the modeling you saw this morning, which I have many, many issues with, there are many people who will tell you that energy efficiency is wildly cost effective. You can get all these emission reductions. We don't see that. We've done a lot of work in that space. We're the pioneers of energy efficiency. Our building invented the term demand-side management. Now, while we see there's a lot of efficiency gains to be had, a lot of them are baked into that baseline already. And a lot of them are not negative cost. Once you get down to market discount rates and the actual removal of double counting and what we call the bounce back effect. If cars get greater miles to the gallon, people drive them further. If people use have less kilowatt hours in terms of lighting, they'll use their lights more. We know this. This is happening already in many other areas of the economy. So the idea that there are billions of tons of free offsets or free allowances just waiting out there is very, very tough for us to see in the real world. What we can see, though, is fuel switching. We've seen that in the European emissions trading scheme. And that, again, is going to handle somewhere north here of $20 a ton, $30 a ton. Now, there is one way out of this conundrum, and that's the abundance of offsets, greenhouse gas emission offsets, taken from outside the cap and brought inside the cap. And I'll explain that a little bit more as we get going. Let's talk about these offsets. What are they? What are the benefits of them, and what are the risks? I've got 4 pictures here that kind of are some kinds of examples of offsets around the world. There's a coal mine methane destruction facility. Today, when we mine coal around the world, in the US as well, we vent methane fugitively. Methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. If we captured that methane and burned it, we destroy that methane. In agriculture, we can do it at large scale on confined animal feeding operations, methane lagoons, basically. Throw a tarp over them, light a match. Another one here is wind farms, say in China, a very, very large source of clean development mechanism credits. Renewable energy and energy efficiency projects in the developing world, countries that do not have emission reduction targets, qualify or could qualify as offsets. They're the largest one of the largest sources of offsets today in the international carbon market. I do want to be clear, though. Renewable energy projects here in the United States and energy efficiency projects will not count as offsets. They'll be under the cap. Assuming the cap covers the electric sector, those activities are good things. They'll help the electric sector achieve their own emission reduction responsibility to comply with the law if and when it's passed. But they're not offsets. That's not mean that they're good or bad. It's just they're a different mechanism by which they get covered in the regulatory scheme. But in China, where they're unregulated, you can emit freely. Putting a wind project in and reducing the grid emissions can definitely generate emission reductions. The one in the upper right is work we've done here with Michigan State. These are some fields that are involved in our on-field trials of nitrous oxide emissions abatement through reduced fertilizer use that you heard Neville and others speak about earlier. And then down here you have probably the largest emission source on the planet other than energy production, deforestation of the world's tropical forests. Probably the largest opportunity on the globe for generating offsets and reducing emissions cheaply is stopping the deforestation and degradation of tropical rainforests, principally in 2 countries, maybe 3. Brazil, Indonesia, and the Congo Basin. Those are the 3 places in the world where you really need to attack this. Now, what are offsets? Let's be clear about them. They're credits for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, avoidance, or sequestration, any of those 3 activities. But the really important part is that occur in sectors or geographic regions outside of the regulatory emissions cap. So for example, in the Waxman-Markey bill, they envision a cap that covers virtually 85% of the US economy. That is industrial sources, transportation, electric power generation, oil and gas operations, all would be covered by a cap that those entities operating within that cap would have to comply with the emission reduction requirements in there. The sectors that are outside the cap that would be sources for offsets, ag and forestry. That's pretty much it. Now, how do these offsets work? Neville alluded to this in his talk previously with the nitrous oxide emissions. Let me make a simpler example. Say this is a landfill that emits methane fugitively. And it would emit that methane over time, and that amount would come down over time as the landfill anaerobically digested the source of those emissions. you could put a collection device on that landfill, and you could light a match, and you could burn that methane and convert it to CO2, changing its global warming potential from 21 to 1. You don't have to generate power with it, you just need to convert it to CO2 and water, and you've reduced the methane emissions quite a bit. If you do that, you drop emissions from here to here. That difference, that credit, that's the offset. But there's a lot of challenges in this picture. For example, you have to know what this baseline is. Well, once you've done a project, you can never know the baseline. There's a counterfactual there. You can't measure it out into the future if you've already implemented the project. And if you haven't implemented the projects, well, then you don't have a project. So we have to come up with a way to do these baselines that's based partially on empirical information and partially on modeling. And therein lies the rub. So in the trade, we say offsets are emission reductions that must be real. They actually have to happen, okay? They have to be additional. That means they have to come about because of the existence of the carbon market. They weren't business as usual. You didn't do them for some other reason. You did them because there's a carbon market. You did them because there's a carbon regulatory regime that allowed you to capture the rent associated with offsets. They have to be permanent. They're not coming back. Or we have to make an approach in the regulatory world for dealing with them when they do come back. I'll talk about that in a minute. They have to be measurable. We have to be able to count them, and they have to be verifiable. Somebody has to be able to go out there and audit them and see that the emission reductions you claimed actually took place. So let's talk about some forestry and agricultural ones. Afforestation and reforestation are two of the biggest talked about. Afforestation is growing trees where they didn't grow at some date certain. Under the Kyoto Protocol, that's January 1st, 1990. If they grew on a site before that, it's reforestation. If they didn't, then it's afforestation, also known as A&R. Now, if you think about this, in one sense, this is a good one. You can grow trees on marginal agricultural land or land that's really even not suitable for agriculture, and you can store carbon in trees. Now, we got to talk scale, though. Okay, I have a good example of this. 1,000 megawatt coal-fired power plant, which would be a standard baseload coal-fired power plant, emits about 7 million tons of CO2 a year. If you grow trees on pretty decent land, not decent enough to make it commercial timber, but pretty high quality, so it grows pretty fast and sequesters carbon, and you assume it sequesters, say, 350 tons over 100 years, 3.5 tons per acre per year. Well, guess what? You need 2 million acres of land. That was 2 million acres of land to offset the emissions of one coal-fired power plant, and we have hundreds of them. So it's not really scalable, okay? Red, we talked about. Emissions from deforestation is about, depends who you talk to, somewhere in the neighborhood, according to the IPCC, about 12 to 18% of global emissions. So this is a big dog. You can go after this one and you can really make a dent in climate change. Soil, carbon, and agriculture. I won't talk much about that in this audience. You guys know a lot about that topic. Other than to mention, I'm really pleased that we've had an opportunity to talk about this avoided nitrous work that MSU has pioneered and we've been delighted to fund. 8 of our companies within the EPRI membership have funded phase 1 of that work, which was the scientific work, and we're about to move forward with phase 2 again with MSU, where we're taking the protocol that Neville and Phil and others put together, and we're going to take it through the standard setting organizations, such that farmers actually could generate actual offsets doing this. Methane destruction, we mentioned, another one that's possible in ag. There are 3 other kinds of methane destruction, but in the Waxman-Markey bill, they essentially took them out of offsets and said we're going to regulate them directly. Coal mine methane, fugitives from the natural gas transmission and distribution system, that is methane that just leaks out of the pipelines. I forgot what the third one was. But in any case, those are out in the current bill, but they could very well be back in. Senator Stabenow from this state has been proposing what she calls her offsets amendment that has a whole slew of agricultural offset project types included in it. And many parties believe that if and when the Kerry Graham-Lieberman bill goes forward, it'll have the Stabenow amendment inside it as its offsets provision. The agriculture and forestry sectors are expected to be by far the largest sectors within the United States as sources of offsets. Now let's talk about the benefits of offsets. Why do it? So this is Congressional Budget Office estimates. They estimate in 2030, in the year 2030, the program that's outlined in the Waxman-Markey bill would cost the country $250 billion that year. 250, that's with a B, billion dollars, if you didn't allow offsets, or even if you did, if for some reason they didn't come to market. But if the amount of offsets, which are enormous in the Waxman-Markey bill, 2 billion tons per year are allowed, if those actually materialized, came to market, and were used, they estimate the cost to the economy to be more like $100 million. So that's like a third, maybe 40%, right? And the CO2 price, they estimate in 2030 would be $40 a ton with offsets, and without them, $140 a ton. So a dramatic world difference between a world with offsets at large scale and without. Now, they say the cost savings to the economy generated by offsets could be substantial. Annual savings from offsets could be about 70% under the bill as written. So if they come, they dramatically reduce the cost both to our members, the electric sector, and the emitters in the electric sector, but more importantly, to this society as a whole. Essentially what we're doing is we're allowing the substitution of lower cost abatement, whether domestic forestry and ag abatement or abatement in China, India, Brazil, and Mexico, to be used in place of higher cost abatement that could be done in the US electric and industrial sectors. Now, offsets are not a panacea. They have technical challenges, and I want to be very blunt about that. We're very aware of the technical challenges, and we've done quite a bit of work at EPRI and with our colleagues in many of the stakeholder groups to try to think this through. First off, additionality. You have to basically show an offset project really is new and different. It wasn't required by law, regulation, it's not common practice. It really came about because of the carbon market. And that's a very tough thing to do. That's really a policy call on which things are additional and which aren't. Or even the tests that get designed are a policy call. What are these tests and how do they work? You can't prove this one. Baselines we talked about, you can't prove them either. You have to make an agreement. A standard has to be set. Somebody has to decide what is that baseline. Neville talked about how in the nitrous oxide world it could be 5 years of a farmer's nitrogen fertilizer records. Is that good enough? Which standard will that be good enough for? Are there other ways it could be done? There are endless fights about these two. Now in ag and forestry there are two that are really unique, that are really important. Leakage and permanence. This is a picture of impermanence. You store carbon in trees, trees can die. Disease can get them or fire can get them. In that case, CO2 is rapidly emitted back into the environment. Well, if you already issued carbon offsets for these trees, and they've already been used by Detroit Edison for compliance with a cap and trade, and then the forest burns up, who's liable for that increase in CO2 emissions? So the standards and protocols that are being developed around the country have ways of dealing with permanence. Leakage is another one. There was some talk this morning about leakage. That's that thing we heard in the plenary, indirect land use change. My colleague Steve Rose, who's an expert modeler, was at EPA and is now at EPRI, does a lot of work looking at the impacts of afforestation policies in the north and how they affect deforestation in the south. Suffice it to say, if we had a policy in the US where we allowed afforestation to generate carbon credits, but not comprehensive forest policy, just afforestation, basically all that carbon abatement is blown out by increased deforestation in Brazil. And the reason for that is we take land out of production in the US to grow trees, and they burn trees to put land into production. And the modeling is very tight on those relationships. I think Ruben may talk more about that. There's some other issues, measurement, monitoring, and verification. And some parties don't like the idea that offsets reduce the carbon price. Their worldview is different. They say, wait a minute, we need these advanced new technologies. So the higher the carbon price out of the box, the better. The higher the price, the more advantage there is to new technology and entrepreneurship. And so let's have at it right away. Now, certainly, those who are concerned about the cost of policy, the cost of power users, the cost to the economy of a whole, that's not their view. So these challenges, I think, from our perspective, all of them can be addressed. But there is definitely an inherent challenge that can't. There is a challenge between the perfect environmental integrity, that every offset is 100% perfect, and the desire to scale up and get these things on the ground very, very rapidly. That's not going away. Now, hopefully we can have large scale and do it cost effectively and have very, very high quality offsets, but it's virtually impossible to guarantee it 100% of the time. And I think those parties who study this or are involved in it, they recognize that. Let's talk briefly about the bill. This is the only bill that has passed the House. Congressman Waxman and Markey passed this last June, and it was quite a bellwether event in American climate policy. There's been a lot of analysis done on the bill, and I want to point to a few things. So first off, offsets are a key source of compliance in the bill as modeled by both EPA and the US EIA. I chose the EIA pictures because they're easier to sort of show and understand. So this is in their base case. Compliance here is the whole area under the curve. That's the amount of abatement you need over this time frame to 2030 to comply with the requirements in the bill. Now, in their basic case, virtually a huge portion, more than half of the abatement, comes from international emission offsets from places like China, Brazil, India, Mexico, and Korea, and the USSR and other places, okay? A smaller amount are these green domestic abatement, and then this gray area here, that's the electric sector in the United States. And that in the near term is fuel switching gas for coal, and in the longer term, the retirement of older plants and the development of newer, renewable, and higher efficiency fossil plants. What's interesting is here, you don't see all this other stuff that people talk about. You don't see building energy efficiency. You don't see solar power here. This is the EIA. This is their, given today's prices, today's projected performance of technologies, and the prices of those technologies going forward to 2030. Your government's basically telling you the lowest points of compliance are international offsets, domestic offsets, and the US electric sector. This area in here is carbon capture and storage. Now, in a world that, say, the law didn't allow international offsets, or say they don't come, this is one of their bookends. No international offsets and limited technology development. Limited means nuclear, about what we have today, and no advances in carbon capture and storage. For those of you who might have seen Skiles' talk next door, that's sort of the limited portfolio that EPRI did. And you can see here what happens is much more electric sector abatement and more domestic offsets because of the higher carbon price. You don't see any of the other technologies. Okay, these are the things. The electric sector is the lowest cost place in the economy to get emission reductions, but they're not cheap. What they conclude is really interesting at EIA. They say, given the potential of offsets as a low-cost compliance option, the amount of reduction in the covered emissions is exceeded by the amount of compliance generated by offsets. Okay? And in the base case, domestic abatement, that is actual abatement in the United States, reductions of emissions here, is only 39% of cumulative compliance. Now that's a stunning thing from two perspectives. On one hand, clearly those who think offsets are important have made an impact in Congress, where Congress has recognized the importance of offsets, put a lot of them in the bill, and recognized their importance for cost containment. But now, I got to tell you, the flip side has occurred to our industry. They said, well, wait a minute, that's all nice on paper, but what are these again? And where am I getting these? And how do I plan for them in the future? I'm going to be doing emission reductions in China? How am I going to do that? I'm Detroit Edison. Is the Michigan Public Service Commission going to approve rates to go by offsets in Bolivia? So this is a whole unknown area that's very frightening to many folks in the US electric sector and industrial sectors and oil and gas sectors, because they see a way to comply that's cheaper than their own abatement. That's good. But they're also not quite sure, what are these things and where would I get them and can I get rate relief for doing it? This is some modeling EPRI did. We asked the question using the same model that EIA uses, the National Energy Modeling System, what it would take to comply with Waxman-Markey in a world that has different amounts of offsets that come to market. Okay? If you believe the EPA worldview, or EIA, or the people who wrote the bill, that 2 billion tons are waiting to be developed, they'll show up overnight as soon as the bill passes, and they're there, then the price of carbon is very, very low, somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, $10 a ton, rising to that 40 number you saw in the CBO analysis. Most parties who study this don't believe there's anywhere near 2 billion tons offsets coming to the United States, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. If you assume there are less, say you start at 0 in 2012, very close to 0, that's about what we've got now, a few million tons here and there, and you ramp them up over time to 2 billion by 2030, a billion or half a billion. Now you start to see prices out of the box in the neighborhood of $40 to $90 a ton CO2. Those, I can tell you, are frightening numbers to people in the US Congress and the regulatory agencies. They see that and they figure they've got to find a way to contain the costs of carbon. Otherwise, they'll pass law and the whole thing will explode. Now let's talk about domestic offsets, forestry and ag. These are EPA's numbers. Now they are allowed in the bill. 1 billion tons US domestic offsets would be allowed for compliance every year. And the question is, are they there? Well, EPA's own analysis shows in the period up till 2020, annual quantities are somewhere on the order of expected 170 million tons at a $15 price point. At a higher price point, more will come. But that's a far cry from 1 billion. And if you look out here and you have a world with no international offsets and higher prices out of the box, you might get 300 million tons. Okay? These are not 1 billion tons. Now the question is, what are these? Well, if you actually look deep in the appendices, you'll find that most of these are forest management and afforestation. They haven't even considered, they did consider nitrous oxide emission reductions, but they weren't aware of the fine work going on at MSU, in part because it hadn't been published yet when they did this work. And so in their modeling, reducing fertilizer has a dramatic hit on yields, and so it's not economic. Part of the magic of the work that Phil and Neville and others here have been doing have been showing that you can reduce nitrous oxide emissions substantially without harming yield, in which case it doesn't really affect the farmer's profitability directly. So these are in the near term forest management, and as you go out in the longer term, they're afforestation. It takes time to grow trees. So we talked about afforestation doesn't scale very well, and forest management is particularly problematic from an offsets perspective. What this boils down to is a farmer or forester saying, I was going to harvest these trees in year 35, but because of carbon regulation, I'm going to wait till year 40. That's a very, very tough thing to demonstrate from a regulatory perspective. There are very few protocols out there today that count forest management. And people are wrestling with how are you really going to do that? And these numbers are really an artifact of the modeling. I think if Bruce was here, I don't know if Bruce is in the room, Bruce talked a little bit about FASOM. This modeling comes out of FASOM, Bruce's model. And one of the things that you'll learn with FASOM is that it counts carbon across huge swaths of area. So it could be adding, say, 1/4 ton per acre over 90 million acres. But you're not going to have an offset project in forestry across 90 million acres of forest. It's got to be a dedicated space that you can measure, monitor, and verify. So these are very challenging. I mentioned earlier the bill leaves out landfill gas, coal mine methane, and natural gas fugitives. If those got thrown back in, EPA estimates about another 130 million tons. Still nowhere near 1 billion. So, and then also, these programs are going to take tremendous time to develop. The CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, the world's largest offset program, has taken since, well, it was part of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. It got its operating rules in 2003. It issued its first credit in 2006. And as of today, the best estimate for what it will generate in the entire 5-year horizon of the Kyoto Protocol, 2008 to 12, 5 years, over that whole horizon, maybe 1 billion tons is the current estimate. And the Waxman-Markey bill envisions 1 billion tons domestic and another 1 billion tons international. So these numbers are far beyond what the real world is really delivering. So in our view, limited sectoral eligibility and difficulty implementing ag and forestry offsets means basically that domestic offsets are going to be limited in the near term. I think everybody agrees with that who's looked at this. Now, I want to just put a plug in. I started with this. This work we're doing at MSU is really groundbreaking and really, really important. In part, it's really important because of what Neville said. Neville said it's possible that just that emission reduction that he's calculated that doesn't affect farmer yield could yield on the order of 50 million tons of emission reductions annually in the United States. That's a very large number compared to the total that's being talked about across the whole ag sector. So this is a big deal, this nitrous work, and it can be done in other countries around the world as well. Let's talk very briefly about international offsets. The bill envisions 4 types. Sectoral offsets. These are offsets in entire sectors of national economies. Somehow we'll make a deal with the entire Chinese electric sector. I know Skyle's waiting to do that. And somehow the Chinese electric sector will get paid by a US electric company or perhaps the government, and then we'll sell offsets into the United States. Never been done. We don't really know how this architecture would work, and it was tabled in in Copenhagen. Now this will likely go forward in some way, shape, or form. Reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, RED in the trade, is a kind of sectoral offset, but this is going to be a long road. Okay, offsets issued by an international body, that was envisioned to be CDM. That is, the Waxman-Markey bill would allow existing international offsets into the regime in the United States. As we talked about, we're thinking that the whole CDM worldwide is going to do about 1 billion tons over a 5-year period. And in addition to not having the quantity and scalability, we would be competing with the EU, Japan, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand to buy those offsets. So it's challenging to see how they'll come from the international body. RED, a very, very large potential source. Now the one drawback on RED, or one of the drawbacks on RED, is several of the countries that RED is a key thing, Brazil and Indonesia, they've made international commitments now, particularly Brazil has passed federal law in Brazil recently after Copenhagen. They've agreed with the international community that the Brazilians on their own will reduce their emissions 40% by 2020. And embodied in that commitment is an 80% reduction in their deforestation, which they're taking on themselves. So it's sort of a zero-sum game, in my particular view. If the Brazilians are doing it for themselves, they can't sell it to emitters in the north. And so there's an inherent tension between, on one hand, we want the developing countries. You know, you'll hear congressmen say, we're not doing anything until China's in. Okay, that's great. In the same breath, they'll say, but we want cheap offsets. Well, you can't have both. If China and India and Brazil are in the international accord, a lot of those offsets just evaporated because they're using them for their own internal mitigation. It's an important thing to remember. So it's very, very difficult to see how these international offsets can yield something like 1 billion or 1.5 billion tons a year as envisioned under the Waxman-Markey bill. So let me leave you with some key insights. From our view, offsets are a really important bridge to a low-carbon future. They allow time for research, demonstration, and development of all these other key technologies that I've mentioned. And they're critical to containing cost in the US federal system. They achieve emission reductions in uncovered sectors and regions, and they encourage innovation in those sectors. That's for sure. You talk to people in the offset world today, they are scouring the globe for offsets. They're going to gas flaring projects in Nigeria. I know a guy who went to Western China looking at landfills. There are people all over the world just searching for offsets. But there is this inherent conflict between the perfect ideal of environmental integrity and the desire to scale up offsets very, very quickly and have them available for the market. And the massive scale envisioned in the bill, it's just hard for those who really study this to see this. Even the biggest boosters don't see 1 billion tons domestically and 1 billion tons internationally coming in to the US system. That's why right now climate policy is sort of on the rocks in the US. There's a recognized political need to have cost containment, somehow to make sure that the cost of carbon doesn't spike higher or stay higher than we're sort of willing to accept. We don't really know what willing to accept means, and we don't really know how to contain the price. Offsets are a great idea to do it. The problem is delivering them in a short order at large scale. So although the supply of offsets is likely to be limited in the near term, virtually all of them in the US are going to be in forestry and ag. That's for certain. Unless we have what could be a bill that's confined to just the electric sector, perhaps the Kerry Graham-Lieberman bill, and then other sectors like emission reductions outside that, could be in industry, could be in oil and gas, those might count as offsets then. The size of the cap depicts which sectors are in or out, and which sectors are in or out decides which are available for offsets. So we need new designs desperately and new approaches to figure out how we're going to scale up offsets, particularly in ag and forestry, to a meaningful and large scale. That's really the challenge. And finally, offsets are a way that you can link the evolving markets for carbon around the world. The CDM, this UN program, issues a unit of reduction called the Certified Emission Reduction, the CER. And that unit is becoming the US dollar of carbon trade. Programs as they evolve around the world are all sort of saying, we'll take the CER. And as soon as 2 or more programs accept that, now you have fungibility among the programs. And that's really the holy grail for those who believe in global cap and trade, because if you can get all those markets linked, then you can equalize the price of carbon around the world. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. Last thing I'll say is if you want any of our offsets-related work, all of our research is available online for free. We've run a series of workshops in Washington, which Ruben has participated in, and many others. All of the presentations are online at EPRI.com. Thanks a lot for your time.